All right, very happy to have Todd Myers here. We are live talking about something climate, some word that goes after climate, but it keeps changing, so I'm having a hard time keeping up with it. Todd, climate wasn't even the first word. It used to be global warming. Then I think climate change came after that. Now I see climate crisis quite a bit, and then I've been seeing the change to climate emergency. I should give a quick introduction to Todd. He's the environmental director at the Washington Policy Center. He also has a book. Where's the book? Right here. Time to Think Small. Time to Think Small. And I'm going to read how nimble environmental technologies can solve the planet's biggest problems. Because what we're going to talk about related to my first question, Todd, is when you see stuff like this, journalism should reflect what the science says on global heating. Oh, that's new. I didn't even figure that when I read it the first time. Global heating. So see, there's another new word. The climate emergency is here. And, you and I met when I was an environmental reporter for King, which is the NBC affiliate in Seattle. Yep. And I said when I posted this on my locals page for questions, which I take ahead of time for interviews over there, go over there and join my editorial board, $5 a month. And you can, either ask questions or verbally berate my guests, whatever you want to do, but it's $5 for the best adventure you'll ever have on the internet. I told them you got more side eye than anybody I ever interviewed about the environment in Seattle, because it was such a homogenous environment when it comes to this topic. And in large part because of the way the media reports on this, and something I really did not question. I really did not question the homogeneity of the narrative. And I think, in part because I was, I was, I don't know if you call it a victim, but I mean, I was manipulated by a lot of the similar press releases and stuff that you would probably look at and say, you're like the lone voice crying in the wilderness out there. And we can get into that in a second, but let's just start with the topic at hand. Since you talk a lot about small changes or like what people can do, and then you see stuff like this, which seems to me to be kind of teed up towards government action or intervention, right? How do these word changes and sort of pressuring journalists to change the way they talk about this translate to government intervention? And thanks for being here.
Yeah, thanks for having me on. We've known each other for a long time. It's the first time we've been together. The reason I write about small efforts and empowering people is because the closer you are to the problem, the more likely you are to have an honest assessment and deal with the reality of what's going on. If it's a big problem, right, you're going to have a big solution. But if it's not a big problem, you're going to adjust your solution and your approach to it based on the feedback you get. And the closer you are to the problem and the more accountability you have to solving the problem, right? If you don't save gasoline, save energy, help provide habitat to help animals, you're going to see that and it's going to impact you. The more distant you are from the problem, the less accountability you have for whether a policy works or not, the more likely you are to maximize sort of the sense of how good you feel, how good it reflects on you. Nobody makes their career fighting jaywalking, right? People die jaywalking, but jaywalking is such a small issue. Nobody's going to say, you know what I did? I fought jaywalking. No, they're going to say, you know what I'm doing? I'm saving the entire planet for future generations, right? It's sort of the reflected glow of how big the issue is. So when they say it's a climate crisis and then a climate emergency, the bigger the problem, the bigger the person is who's trying to solve that problem. And so there's a strong incentive to do that when you're detached from accountability for the results. And the other thing that does for politicians is when you say climate crisis, it puts you into a crisis mentality. When you tell somebody they have a crisis mentality, you are not giving them a compliment. Right? What you're saying is you're not thinking clearly, you're thinking emotionally about this. But for politicians and for others who want to feel big, that's great. They want to say, there's no time to think, just do what I say. And so it really works well for extreme environmental groups. There's a lot of environmental groups that I work with that I like very much, but extreme environmental groups raise this crisis mentality. Politicians raise this crisis mentality because they don't want to be held accountable, and they want to maximize, their sense of righteousness. So I think that there's a lot of things going on there in the effort to raise the temperature, metaphorically, of the language, because it benefits them in a number of different ways.
Tell people a little bit about how you have found reporters to be often stenographers for press releases that align with the confirmation bias already within the newsrooms.
Yeah, so if you read newspaper articles or see TV, there are plenty of good reporters. I mean, like the way that you and I started becoming friends and work together is that I would present you with information, and you would start questioning it, and then you'd challenge me and say, "All right, let me see your sources," and I would show them to you. That's not always the case, and a lot of times, environmental stories are simply stories that are basically quoting either press releases or quoting spokespeople for environmental agencies. So I'll give you a good example. In December, the Washington State Department of Ecology released CO2 data for Washington State. Now, our governor constantly talks about how he's the climate governor. He ran for president, touting his record on climate change. But the 2019 data, I know it's 2023, but it was 2022, but they just released the 2019 data, and it went up again. So it went up. It has gone up virtually every year, every year but one for the governor, CO2 emissions. And so they released it. And the funniest thing is that even though every year, like I said, every year but one, CO2 emissions have gone up in Washington State, at the same time they were predicting it would go down. There's a great quote in their press release that made it into the newspaper where it says, "We've analyzed our policies and they are working as intended." That's simply not true, right? Every year they would say our emissions are about to turn. I mean, they literally would use "turn the corner." We're about to turn the corner and start going down. And then the next year they would always go up. And then they would say, "Oh, we're doing great. Everything is working as we planned." And that was in the article. And
it's the truest thing that's ever been said.
Yes. So the reporter never stopped and said, "Wait a minute. How can you say that? Every year you predict that emissions are going to go down, and every year they go up."
Yeah, well, maybe it's because they're like, "Yeah, this is exactly what we intended. We intended it for it to go up because that way we stay in business, and we got to keep coming back to help you out." I got to tell you, Todd, since I got out of the sort of corporate press environment, and I could go talk to whoever I want, which is why I invite crazy people like you on. No, I'm just kidding. Is that I went from somebody who kind of just accepted the status quo as, I don't know, just kind of it's just sort of the best case scenario, I guess, with a bunch of just bumbling, humans trying hard. And we just got here somehow. And I didn't really put a whole lot of stock into how intentional some of the efforts are to keep the sort of narratives going that we just kind of accept, and that we get very angry at people for questioning. I didn't see the intention. I still think for the most part, even the people that you're the most critical of, or I'm the most critical of, I still think they sleep pretty well at night telling themselves I'm here to serve the public. I'm doing the best I can. And if you don't agree with me, it's just because obviously you're not enlightened like I am, or you just don't care. You don't care about the environment. And I should say, when I first crossed your path, you had written me after I tweeted about this press release. It was a press event at the Seattle Aquarium. They had this, plastic bag monster running around with plastic bags attached to him. And they were talking about how the politicians were there, and the Seattle Aquarium folks were there, talking about this plastic bag ban they were going to enact. And they do these things where they get you, they know that you have no time to get your job done every day, and so they have everybody there in one spot, and they have a plastic bag monster running around. Then you get all your B-roll of all the plastic bags you need, boom, you even get to stop for coffee on the way back to the newsroom. It's a great day. It's a one-stop shop. And so I tweeted about it, and you wrote me and you're like, hey, just, you might want to look into plastic bag bans. They don't necessarily do what the politicians say. And I never had anybody question that. So I at least I was open enough at that point to say, okay, I'll go see what Todd Myers has to say. So I started researching online, and I find out, sure enough, you're right. There are people out there that say, once you sort of crunch the data on the entire life cycle analysis of a paper bag versus a plastic bag, that paper bags, you could argue are worse for the environment due to water and fertilizer and all this other stuff. Or at the very least, you could say it's not as simple as they might say, right? The plastic bag on the out cycle, like on the end of life cycle, it may be worse for the environment because it doesn't biodegrade, but the production of a plastic bag takes far less environmental resources than a paper bag. Anyway, long story short, when I change my report and I go on television, I got an email. What are you, a show for the plastics industry? Because that's what happens, especially in the Seattle area. Like you start asking questions about this, and it's crazy. So here you are, like one of the few people that's offering an alternative viewpoint, disagree or agree with what Todd's got to say. I'm grateful for people like you, and at least, in Seattle, where it's, like I said, a very homogenous environment, and journalists just kind of just take it as is. Like they look at you're the outlier, and they just think, I don't know, that guy's got to have some kind of, hand in some other kind of money pot or something to even ask these questions. Then I get out of that world and I see, there are a lot of people actually asking these questions that have, a significant amount of scientific training. So like, let's just at least listen to what they have to say and not just write them off right away. Then I leave the Seattle TV market. I'm no longer a journalist. You and I paired together on a couple of videos for the Washington Policy Center showing how communities, in that particular case, tribes, were working on their own projects, which also kind of, I don't know, I wouldn't say necessarily went against the pop narrative, but at least showed that you don't necessarily need to have the government constantly intervening in order to make good changes or protect environmental resources. But I'm curious, as you have been somebody who's been talking a lot about that, what's a reaction you've gotten, like, hey, look, I talk about people who care about natural resources. I just, I'm just skeptical of these narratives because of the government kind of coming in, swooping in to help. What's the reaction that you get from people? They say, oh yeah, you're right, Todd. I guess you make a good point that sometimes the government makes it worse instead of better. And we do see that you have bees on your property, and so you must not like totally hate the environment, or do they still think, you're nuts?
It varies. So you talk about the tribes. The tribes are, the reason I like working with the tribes is because I'm a member of the Puget Sound Salmon Recovery Council, where we prioritize funding and projects to help Chinook salmon, but all salmon recover in Puget Sound. And I started listening to the tribes and talking with them, and they were doing really interesting things. And so that was why I wanted to look more closely at what they were doing, both with hatcheries, forest management, wildlife management, other things like that. And what I found was they do really effective and good work because they have the local knowledge that I talked about, and they have the incentive, right? If they don't manage their forests well and their forests burn down, their tribal members are right there to let them have it and to tell them that they screwed up. And so the combination of that local knowledge and those incentives makes it so that they make really good environmental decisions. Not necessarily the ones I always want, because there's always an element of personal choice of, people are going to make different decisions and have different priorities, but they make decisions that are good for them, and they don't let environmental problems fester. And if something isn't working, they change it so that it does. So I think that, sort of attachment makes their approach better. When, on the other hand, people are connected to environmental issues, when it becomes an identity issue, right? Look at me, I'm an environmentalist. So when somebody like Todd Myers comes along and says, look, here's the data, and this is not my, I'm not making up this data. I'm getting it from a government source, the Energy Information Administration or U.S. Department of Agriculture or something like that. This is what you say you're worried about snowpack. Okay, great. Here's what the snowpack data are for Washington State. 13 of the last 17 years, we've had above normal snowpack. Why do you think snowpack is going away when the data show it's not? So if environmentalism becomes an identity issue for you and you don't have that local connection or the incentive to be right, what you want is to maximize the benefit to your sort of sense of self-worth. And so even when I present data that says, look, here's what the federal government says about snowpack in Washington state, their answer is, well, you're just a shill for whoever, right? Insert group here, because that allows them to write you off when you're presenting them with evidence that you don't like. There are plenty of really sincere environmental groups, and sincere environmentalists who want to do the right thing. I had a friend on the Salmon Recovery Council who got really upset with me when I said that snowpack isn't declining in Washington state. And so he went to the data and was going to prove me wrong. And he called me and he was like, by God, you were right. Now, what he said is that he thought that there have been changes in how snowpack exists. There's less low-level snowpack. There's more high-level snowpack. That's fine. I think that's an interesting argument, and that may be true. But when environmentalism is an identity issue rather than a science issue or an environmental issue, what you choose is to do and say things that maximize the identity benefit to you, not to help the planet.
It's interesting you bring that up because in this article from Covering Climate Now, which we started with, originally signed by, so I guess you're signing your life away with this one, signed by the Scientific American and Columbia Journalism Review, The Nation, The Guardian, Al Jazeera English, Noticias Telemundo, the Asahi Shimbun, and La Repubblica. Okay, so all these different journalism outlets, and then there's more down here after. So it's interesting. The Maine Monitor, for instance, there's some outlets, other journalism outlets, and I do notice this term being used a lot more. But they're saying, I've had folks say, like, I just can't believe you're talking like this, Allison. Like, what happened to you? Because, quote, this is a statement of science, not politics. That's what they're saying. That journalism should reflect the truth, basically. They should reflect what science says on global heating. The climate emergency is here. So they're trying to say, no, this isn't politics. This is just the truth. I don't know what you think about that. But before you answer, let's talk about real truth here, okay, for a second. Great wine, okay? This is inarguably, scientifically, the best wine on the planet. Okay, no, I'm just kidding. But it is a great way for you to support my work. So if you like Malbecs and you like high altitude Malbecs, where it's very hard to be a grape, and I don't know, I should ask these vineyards what they're seeing at 9,000 feet. But the wine still tastes really good. So you could call it a wine emergency or a wine crisis or global wine heating or whatever you want to call it. But whatever you do, just go to AllisonWinePromo.com, support my work, get 50% off these amazing wines, 50% off shipping, and have a great conversation piece to bring over to dinner with grandma, who you unfriended 2 years ago over everything that's happened. Get her drunk. She'll forget about it right away. She will never remember that you guys voted opposite. You didn't get the shot. She did get the shot. Whatever. Get the wine and, reconcile over something that helps support my work. Like I said, 50% off the wine, 50% off shipping. If you want some organic coffee roast, though, you can go to twinenginecoffee.com/Allison. There's light roast, there's dark roast. Right now I am drinking this. It's the black edition. It's a very good coffee, but I also do a lot of the espresso. I have this espresso maker I got for Christmas, and Todd, I'm experimenting with making my own condensed milk now. So I've been making cafe con leche with my twinenginecoffee.com/Allison. And I didn't even know this, but condensed milk is just basically milk with the steam boiled off. So I take my milk, my raw local cow's milk. I set it on the stove for about 2 hours. I add maple syrup instead of sugar, so it's a lower glycemic issue for me, and butter. I mean, come on. And then you put some espresso in that. Like, that's the drink of champions. So go to twinenginecoffee.com/Allison or AllisonWinePromo.com. Support my work. Keep interviews like Todd coming on the channel. Thanks to my sponsors. Really appreciate it. Okay, Todd. So let's go back to this question that I have for you. So, like I said, and this is what I get from people all the time. Like, you're getting into politics. We're not. What's your response to that?
What we do about climate change and the risk of climate change is not a scientific question. Science informs it, right? It says, here's what can happen if we have, let's assume all their models are correct. All that tells us is here is what the risk from climate change is. But it is not the only risk we face. And the science does not inform us about the best way to address the risk, the cost, or what are the trade-offs. None of those things are in the science. So if I said to you, okay, we can reach our targets, 1.5 degrees Celsius or 2.2 degrees Celsius. Now, let me just start right there. Anything divisible by any round number divisible by 5, you know is not science. That's not how science works. So when somebody says our 2-degree Celsius target is science, you just sort of have to wonder about, do they really believe that? Because round numbers are not scientific. But let's say they say that. Okay, if I said we can keep CO2 emissions to 2 degrees Celsius by paying $1, right? There's a technology that will suck all the CO2 out of the atmosphere or whatever. It's $1. Would we do it? Absolutely. I would write here, you can have the dollar. Now let's say it costs $100 trillion. The science hasn't changed, only the cost. Now you say, well, wait a minute. Now we have to think about this because what else could we do with that $100 trillion? Instead of reducing CO2 emissions, maybe we could mitigate the impacts of CO2 emissions more effectively and, raise people out of poverty and do a variety of other things. Okay. So when people say this is a question of science, that we need to do something, the science can inform us about the risks and the potential impacts, but it does not settle the issue about what we should do, how we should do it, and whether we should use the limited resources that we have in some other way. And I think that is the problem. And the abuse of the term science as a political cudgel, I think is really a big problem. And it is I think if you are a journalist and you talk like that, it shows that you don't understand what science truly is and how decisions are made.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, like you mean like trust the science, or Fauci's like, you question me, you question science, that whole idea. But they do really, they being, I guess it's more like the ethos of newsrooms, having worked in one for over a decade. We went from at the beginning, when I first got into the business, being proud of our sort of intellectual risk taking, I guess. I know journalism's always had its issues, so it's not like it was great 10 years ago or anything. I'm just saying it was more likely you would be encouraged when I first got into the business to seek out the dissident. Then fast forward, when I left in 2019, you were then seen as endorsing the ideas of whoever you associated with. And so thereby you did journalism by dissociation. And so instead of trying to really go out and understand what this outlier was saying and if there was any validity to it, you really went out with the idea that you were trying to disprove them, or, you wouldn't even go talk to them at all. You'd write some kind of hit piece and you wouldn't even give them the time of day, because that would be endorsing them.
Or if you did quote them, you would put some sort of pejorative, right? I mean, what I always get in front of me is, conservative, right wing, something like that. Right? There's always sort of a warning label about,
right,
okay,
there is.
Look who this guy is, right?
Yeah.
That's not on the other side. And, other people either don't get that warning label, or it's a very, environmental, group or something like that. I mean, it's something very friendly.
Mm-hmm. Good point. Right. Well, it's because, I mean, it's like saying, here's water, it's wet. Like, well, duh. When they see it as just the truth, and they, it just is, it doesn't need a disclaimer. So I think the subtext of all of that, when you don't see that disclaimer with they're essentially subconsciously telling you that this person, whoever they are, like, they are objectively what they say, and just need no explanation, because they're kind of like, they're just in our group of reality, versus this person isn't in our group of reality. So we need to help you better understand the danger of sort of, dabbling your toes in their ideology, because they're water that claims to be dry. You know what I mean? So that doesn't make any sense. Water's not dry.
And the sort of the absurdity of this is that many of the people in the environmental groups or environmental journalists who criticize me or sort of question me, I've worked in environmental policy much longer than they have. I've worked at a state agency. I've worked at the Washington State Department of Natural Resources. I've worked with foresters, biologists, right? I've had to make policy on these things. I sit on the Puget Sound Salmon Recovery Council. I've done this as a job for more than 2 decades and worked on these issues firsthand. And then I get a reporter who covers, environment, but also covers other things. And they've been doing it for a few years. And when I tell them something, they sort of look down their nose and they're like, okay, Todd, really? It has nothing to do with, the data, has nothing to do with my experience or lack of experience. It has to do with that they don't like what I'm saying. So it's very frustrating. And again, they can do it because they are detached from accountability for the results of the policies that they are supporting. Whether they work or don't work, it doesn't change them. They feel good about being righteous and fighting for the correct side rather than actually saying, okay, does this work? Does this not work? Oh, it didn't work. We should try something else.
Mm-hmm. Well, climate topics of climate, I would say, were one of the main reasons that I realized I just couldn't stay in that system anymore, because I really did not have the time to educate myself about the topic and then present myself as an authority on television every day in 90 seconds or less, as if I knew what I was talking about. It was topics like climate or water, like the Clean Water Act, for instance. One time I didn't have time to read the Senate report, and my coworker, who had been in the business 45 years, told me to just recycle what NBC said because they're usually right. And I was like, what? That's not that to me. I was one of the only, if not the only, full-time environmental reporter for a TV station in the entire country. There was no way somebody who every once in a while covered the Clean Water Act and hates Trump in New York was going to know more about it than I did. So I was like, that's unacceptable. And it's unacceptable to me that I go on television and pretend like I'm an expert in something, when we all know behind the scenes that I'm not an expert. And so I say now, my issue with my old industry is less that we get it wrong all the time, because I think that's a problem, but it would be okay with me if we just went on television at the beginning of the 5 o'clock newscast and we said, hey, welcome to the 5 o'clock news. We give our reporters about 2 hours and they do everything. So it's highly likely they're missing some things and may have gotten a few things wrong. So just take it with a grain of salt and do the research yourself. If we said that to people, but instead we go on the 5 o'clock news where it's like, thanks for watching the most trusted name in news, or we're the most accurate name in news. And it's a lie. That's the hypocrisy is what bothers me. If you're going to be the most trusted name in news, then you need to reformat the system where you're not only giving your employees more time, but you're encouraging them to take intellectual risks, because when they're not. And climate was one of 2 topics that I was only overtly, and I guess in the objective sense, censored by a manager. Climate was one of those topics where I was told, you do not question this. And not because my boss was saying, because we get so much money from, Al Gore. It's because my boss was a true believer. He really believed that if you questioned any of the narrative of this climate emergency, or if you questioned government involvement in global government involvement in addressing it, that you were essentially psychopath and you didn't deserve to have any airtime. He really believed that. So, okay, let me get you just a couple questions. My junior producer is freaking out in the other room, so I'm going to grab him, bring him in here, and hopefully he's going to calm down. So don't forget, everybody, if you want to go ask questions ahead of time for interviews at alsamar.locals.com, this is where you can sign up. We got a bunch of questions for Todd. Thank God, because I got to go deal with the baby. Okay. For many years now, this is from Kenny, we've heard nothing but propaganda back and forth on the climate issue. A classic example is hearing the polar bear numbers are decreasing, only to find out that it's exactly the opposite. I don't know the truth of the polar bear, so maybe you could enlighten us on that one, Todd, if you know. But what do you consider a reliable source for accurate raw data, so thinking people can research and decide for themselves?
Yeah. So that's a great question. So I think the point about propaganda back and forth is a really good one because, and the reason there can be, again, the reason there can be propaganda back and forth is that because the propaganda suits sort of an emotional purpose of making you feel like you are on the righteous side, and sorting out what's true and what's not is very difficult. There's one other thing, which is sometimes both sides have a point. It's just that their risk tolerance is different. So you might say, okay, I don't really care about whatever. And another side says, well, I care a lot. So if you are not worried about polar bears, then you might say, well, okay, polar bears population is less than it was. That doesn't bother me. Other people love polar bears, and every polar bear that dies needlessly is a problem. So that perception clouds how you characterize what's going on. In terms of the raw data, and this is what I have seen from others, is that polar bear numbers have basically leveled off for the last couple of decades and are actually have gone slightly up. And the reason is that the number one cause of polar bear death was actually hunting, not climate change. Doesn't mean that climate change isn't a risk. It just means that the reduction in hunting right now is outweighing the impact of loss of habitat and forage and other things like that for polar bears. Now, you may say, that's great. We don't want to hunt polar bears. But what if you are a native tribe and hunting polar bears is a traditional part of your culture? Should we tell those people, no, you don't get to hunt polar bears because we're worried about polar bears and the impact of climate change on polar bears? There's all these trade-offs. So the raw data on that one is difficult. I will say that every time I find a site that has data about sea level rise, ice extent, snowpack, temperatures, other things like that, I quickly put it in I save it in my browser because there really is a tremendous amount of data that are available now on these issues. And there's no single one place to go. I will also say that I actually think that government sources of data are generally pretty good. Where I find the problem with government sources of data is the way they interpret them. So for instance, you can find really good snowpack data from the US government. But the EPA will then take it and then they will say, oh, snowpack is declining in Washington state since 1950. And you say, okay, well, why did you choose 1950? And the reason they chose 1950 is because it was one of the highest snowpack levels of the last century. So I find that the raw data, as your questioner points out, to be actually pretty good. I find the interpretations, the government interpretations of those data questionable sometimes.
Okay, one comment on YouTube which I thought was interesting. Existential threat to our democracy, Stevie says, and I was wondering what you think. Should go back to this layout here, and then we'll go back to locals in a second. What you think about the emergency wrapped up in this, or not just wrapped up in it, but like the phrase, climate emergency, being linked to this idea of the threat to the West as we know it, not just the globe, but because I noticed that especially nowadays, anytime you question something that's seems to be of high importance to those sort of behind the scenes of, what we should care about, I guess, whoever that is, it's not just that issue you're talking about. It is it's not even just life itself, like the planet, we're going to be extinct or something or all underwater. It's this threat to, in this case, democracy or all things since the Greco-Roman times, Enlightenment, just thinking rational.
Cats and dogs living together.
Yeah, exactly. How does that fit into all of this? Just this idea that it's not even just questioning science, you're questioning the very, I don't know, just the very foundation of being a thinking person in a working society. That if you're questioning this, you obviously just want to be an anarchist or something worse? You just want to just run roughshod over any rational way of being and living.
First off, I don't want to be an anarchist. I look very bad in black.
Anarchist. Right here.
Look, I think that we have faced a lot of problems, both in terms of environmental and in terms of bad journalism and politics and other things like that in our history. I would say that as annoying as the media and some of these distortions get, they're not new in any particular way. There have always been people who have been, yellow journalism and things like that has always existed. And there have always been people who were biased and slanted and said silly things for one reason or another. I actually think in some ways it is easier to cut through that now because the actual sources of data are available and you can find them. So it is very frustrating. And believe me, I get very upset when I see reporters again and again do what you've talked about, which is censor alternative viewpoints because they just don't want to hear them and it doesn't fit their narrative and things like that. That absolutely occurs. I have seen that. You have seen that. But I also think that we have a lot of power to deal with it. On the other side, you hear that climate change is going to, destroy the planet. And you hear these sort of things. It's like, we're all going to die in 10 years and these really catastrophic claims. When if you look at the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, again, I'm using their data. This is not data. This is not, I'm not finding someone else who said, well, they ran the numbers differently. The Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change's own economic models say that in the year 2100, the world will be richer under any scenario. Richer. Not as rich as it would be without climate change, but it will be richer. And some of the biggest increases are in developing countries. That's what we hear is that, oh my God, this is going to crush developing countries. And what the data shows is that's simply not true. The frustrating thing I find is that when I say, look, snowpack is actually increasing, not decreasing. These other things are not as bad as people say. What people interpret me, disingenuously, I think, but people interpret me to say it's not a problem. I don't think that. I think there is a risk. I think it is a risk worth addressing at the right price. And there are things we can do to reduce the risk that make a lot of sense. And that's in my book, I actually talk about things that can help you reduce your environmental impact, reduce CO2 emissions, reduce, other things in ways that saves you money, in ways that gives you actual tangible benefit. So let's do those things. But if we are constantly talking about how we're all going to die, it just takes us out of a mindset where we can deal with that data reasonably and make good decisions.
Okay. Stevie says, follow up, Allison's boss is literally breathing down her neck. It's true. Okay.
Not the first time for you.
No. Okay. Can Todd give stats on the real carbon estimate for various continents and the history, say back 10,000 years as is estimated? Also, what is the current status of the ominous rising seas and oft-reported melting ice cap polar bears? Another polar bear question. Lastly, there must have been a reason we started talking about polar bears years ago. Like they're so cute or something, like why they were tapped as the spokesperson, both for Coca-Cola, which is weird. Remember how, polar bears drink Coca-Cola and they're also, I think the Coke's killing them. I don't know. My money would be on that. If they're drinking too much Coke, I'd put my money on that. Lastly, any comment on the fear porn of increasing natural disasters compared with 100, 200, et cetera years ago? So there's a lot there, Todd. Not sure how much of that is serious and how much is tongue in cheek, but whatever you want to take.
So I'm not an expert on the CO2 levels and temperatures for the last 10,000 years. There are lots and lots of people who have done those using ice core samples and things like that. You can find that. I don't have that data. Again, I am not a scientist, and so I don't make scientific arguments. I tend to look at the data that other people have. And when I double check it, like government sources, I tend to find that they're fairly decent. And what's interesting is that oftentimes, like I said, they contradict the narrative. So you can go to the agency that provides the data and read what they say, and the data contradict what they're saying. On sea level rise, the best source that I have found is NASA. Actually, I think it's a reliable source. They have a web page. It's climate.nasa.gov, and then they have vital signs and a number of things, and then sea level. And then they have they measure sea level rise, and they can tell you how they do it with buoys and other things like that. So they say it has gone up 100 millimeters, about a tenth of a meter, since 1990, I think it is. Now, that actually is a slower rate than you see in a lot of the projections about that it will grow by a meter by the year, which is just over 3 feet, by the year 2100. So, and if you look at I'm looking at the data right now, it's kind of leveled off the last few years. So I think that's fairly reasonable estimate. So that's where I get the sea level rise. And again, the fact that it is going up more slowly according to their data than some of the alarmism you hear, I think indicates that they're arguing against their own interests, which makes me think it's more reliable.
Okay, my county declared a climate emergency in 2017 in spite of my never seeing any lawns spontaneously combust, President Bedouin says. Do you have any recommendation? But do you guys sprinkle yet with use sprinklers with Gatorade yet, like Idiocracy? Is that happening yet? Do you have any recommendations on how I can work at the local level to talk sense into the county council, neighbors, and others? I can't post anything on nextdoor.com as it would be taken down as being political. I remember Paul Ehrlich's predictions from the 1970s as a kid, and I think we need to turn down the thermostat on fear and panic. You know, one other thing just to kind of add here, I don't know why I just started thinking about this, but one time I was sent to cover Gore's visit to Seattle. And he was there talking about, his movie. And I think maybe the next one was coming out or something. And I couldn't help but notice that the food they served was all imported from we had like Turkish figs and all these things that, here I was sitting in the Seattle area where you grow food all year long. It's like the breadbasket of the Pacific Northwest. You could have sourced locally easily if you'd wanted to. And said, it just, and I don't know, maybe they would argue, well, we just didn't have the resources for that. It would cost too much. I don't know. But I just always find it interesting that when some of the folks who have the loudest voices to discuss these problems and solutions have the opportunity to actually do something in the moment, to prove how you could be somebody who participates. They I don't know. I just noticed that it's not necessarily something that's always showcased. And so this person's asking what can I do? And it's funny, a lot of these people that are the loudest voices are not doing at least not when they have, they have the big platform. They've got hundreds of people there to watch them talk. Okay. Where's the stuff from the Snoqualmie Valley? Why are we, or the Skagit Valley, we have all these opportunities to feed people at lunchtime locally and support our local economy and everything. Instead, we imported all this food from not just other states, but other countries. It's just weird to me.
Well, a good example of that is last year, actually, 2021 rather, when Governor Inslee took several staff and his wife to Scotland for the climate conference. And somebody did a disclosure request and got the costs of how much the taxpayers paid to send the governor and his staff over to Scotland. So I just looked at the number and I said, for that same amount of money, he could have invested in climate reduction projects that are certified. They reduce CO2 emissions, and we can talk about that. People are skeptical, but I think some of them actually do work. But he could have invested in climate reduction projects that eliminated the CO2 emissions for his entire staff for 2 years. But he didn't do that. He paid for airline tickets. He increased CO2 emissions by doing that. And so, again, to your point, they say climate crisis, but they don't live it. And so with regard to local elected officials, I think there's a couple things you can do. One, simply make the arguments. The one thing I tell people is don't fight about the science. Elected officials are very rarely scientists. They don't know how to assess scientific arguments. What they will believe is what they hear from one person or another that's convenient to them. And so if you go into them and you say, either talk to them or in, in the public comment period, oh, no, your science is wrong. Here's the real science or something like that. They're not going to listen to you because they don't have the ability and they don't have the interest in doing it. So what I think you have to do is to make them live up to their own values. And there's a couple of ways to do that. The first is to say, all right, are you carbon neutral? What are you doing to reduce your CO2 emissions? Have you, there's all sorts of things you can do to eliminate your CO2 emissions by investing in projects or doing other things. What have you done? And if you haven't done those things, why should I trust you? When you're using my money, when you're using taxpayer money, right? You won't use your own money, but you will use taxpayer money. The second thing to do is to set up metrics of accountability. Okay, you say this, you're up for election in 3 years. What will you do if the city hasn't met these targets in 3 years? What we see again and again is that cities miss all of their targets. Seattle, I think, has missed every single one of their climate targets. A lot of the climate targets are in 2020, so they're sort of taking advantage of the COVID shutdown. But prior to that, as I mentioned, Washington State, with our CO2 emissions going up every year, we constantly miss our targets. And so I think, say, all right, what will you do? Here's the targets you've set. You say it's a crisis that we need to do this. What will you do if you don't? Because routinely the policies that are chosen are policies that make them feel good, not that have good results or effective results. And so therefore they constantly miss those targets. So those are the sorts of things I would do rather than fight with them about the science, is make them accountable for their rhetoric. And then that's when they get really nervous. And I think that's more effective than trying to fight them on the sort of the arcane details.
Okay. The linked article from Covering Climate Now, which I posted for folks to see, the one we were talking about earlier, points to the media coverage of COVID-19 as a success, which is a good point. Yeah, they're like, see what we did with COVID-19. We addressed this emergency. It was amazing. And the media totally divided the country over that issue for very, I think, similar points that we're talking about now. So I think that's a good point. Yeah, we did not do, but that, it just goes to show again, like what a lot of, and I was very asleep to a lot of this for a long time. So I quite try to ask myself, like, why did I would have maybe been someone like, look at the success we had here, and didn't even know there were people out there that were just, face palm over it. But yeah, it's a good point. I mean, that was a mess too. Guided by science, journalists have described the pandemic as an emergency, chronicled its devastating impact, called out disinformation, told audiences how to protect themselves. And they were one of the most, the loudest purveyors of government propaganda and a lot of misinformation, but yet they were constantly trying to silence other people. So that was a big mess. Perhaps the real value of journalists getting out over their skis on climate reporting is that it will accelerate the public backlash. I recall one Al Gore's proclamations and seem to recall that his inconvenient untruths have failed to materialize. Interested in your guys' thoughts on this. And one thing too that I'll add to this that I think is unfortunate actually is because of the failures of the media to talk about this, I think with the nuances that it deserves, is that it does oversimplify both the popular narrative and the criticism of it. And then you end up with people like me, for instance, who, or like Todd, you might consider yourself part of this group too, who really do care about natural resources. I want clean water. I'm a, they call me a right-wing hippie, or what did my old boss call me? A right-wing liberal. That was what my boss used to call me, because I really had no home on this topic. I was skeptical of government involvement. And so I didn't fit in very well with a lot of like people who would be of this sort of, nonprofit environmental activism in Seattle. But I did care a lot about the environment. And so because it's like, well, if you talk about the environment, then you must want government intervention and control. So you can't hang out with the conservatives. So then you're like in this world where you don't know where you belong. When I lived in Florida, they told me to turn my brain off a little bit because I was thinking too much about, the environment. When I moved to Seattle, I was like, these people are nuts. They must stay up at night all night, just, fretting over all of this. They never sleep. They're just sweating. I don't belong there. Yeah. So you just, it unfortunately, I think keeps people in this argumentative false dichotomy of like what it means to be someone who cares about issues of the environment, which I do care about. And I would venture to say that a lot of the people who are very loud about this topic probably haven't made the decisions or the changes that we've made for our family to be more, better stewards of the environment. So I don't know. I just add that caveat there. But I guess this is, I don't know. They're asking specifically about COVID, or just what you think about journalists getting out over their skis on climate reporting will accelerate the public backlash.
Yeah.
And what has been the result of getting things wrong or being too alarmist? Has that in fact done the opposite of what they think they want? And in other words, reducing the public's trust in what they're saying.
Yeah. I think there's a couple things there. One, you talk about caring about the environment. So I'm a beekeeper, as you mentioned, and I'm not a beekeeper because of the honey. The honey is good, but I am a beekeeper because they are remarkable creatures. It seems strange that you would choose a hobby where you get, I'm just a hobbyist, but you would get stung 10 times a year. But I just think they're incredible creatures. And I will just tell you one story about why bees give me a reverence for nature, among other things. But it's that reverence for nature and the environment that makes me want to be a good steward. There was a study of bees over winter where they had drawn honeycomb for the winter. And in the winter, what they do is they cluster up to keep warm, like in a little sort of volleyball size. And it was a study hive. And so they had glass at the top. Well, glass is not a good surface to attach honeycomb. And so during the winter, one of the honeycombs was too heavy. It collapsed. And the bees went up, broke cluster, fixed it, and then buttressed the other honeycombs because they realized that what happened to that honeycomb could happen to the others. That's incredible. I mean, that shows understanding and logic from what we think of as just, an insect. And that is the sort of thing that gives me reverence for nature and the desire to do the right thing for the environment and make sure that the things that I'm doing are effective. To the question of journalism, I think that's absolutely right. That when journalists make mistakes and make really egregious mistakes, they lose their credibility and people start to question and think about it. I think that, but it's frustrating because it's not black or white. There are journalists certainly who make mistakes again and again and the same type of mistake, and those people should be written off. But remember, these issues are complicated. I make mistakes, other people make mistakes. And what I tell people is don't feel bad about your mistakes, learn from them and recognize that these issues are complicated. But what's so strange is that, on the vaccine thing, so I used to work in the healthcare industry. I believe a lot in vaccines generally. I literally got the vaccine the first day I was able to for COVID, but I haven't got a booster. And a lot of the media clearly got it wrong that the vaccine would prevent transmission. Doesn't mean that the vaccine isn't valuable. It doesn't mean that the vaccine can't, help those who get it, but it didn't do that. And yet there are still some people who allege that it prevents transmission. And so those sorts of things, I think, make it difficult not to throw the baby out with the bathwater and to sort out what's good from bad. So I don't think, people should just rely on the data or other things like that they're seeing, because oftentimes there's nuance and other things like that. I think that you read, reporters and then look at raw data and other things like that to supplement it. But just remember, these things are complicated, and there's no question, though, that journalists who make repeated mistakes, I think that does help people realize that you can't just take what they say as gospel.
Okay. Journalists or cheerleaders get the pom-poms. My question is, who is pressured and how are they pressuring? Is FEMA involved? I I
So I
guess the
think,
question, is who's doing the pressuring,
yeah,
and where does it come from? And like I said to Todd, like when we were, when I, when I was a journalist and like you and I connected, you were the only person who like ever had a differing view than the press releases that we were often getting. And
it
most
must be
journalists,
because I was paid off, right?
yeah, right. Not them, not the other side was paid off. Or there was a lot of money in activism or anything. No, it couldn't be that. But yeah, I mean, it's easy if you're somebody who's not really thinking too skeptically about all this to just think, well, that if 95% of people say this or organizations say this, this must be the true thing. And if only 1% says this, they must be wrong. But we weren't thinking to ourselves that there. Yep, I will do that. The producer just came in. Take it away, Todd.
Well, there's a couple of things that there. First, it's, I frequently get accused of being in it for the money or getting paid off or something like that. If I wanted to make money in politics, the last thing I would do is to be a conservative environmentalist in Washington state. I can't think of a more of a less lucrative position to take in politics. If I wanted to make money, I would sell out to the other side because there is a lot of money on the other side in environmentalism. So that always makes me laugh that somehow that I choose to be the one person on the other side as the way to make money. So there's a great theory called bootleggers and Baptists. And bootleggers and Baptists, it's based on a prohibition, where you had a coalition of two groups that wanted to ban alcohol. You had the Baptists, who believed it was the demon rum and that it was causing the decline of society and all these sorts of things. And then you had the bootleggers, the Al Capones, who benefited from the prohibition by selling alcohol illegally at very high prices and making a lot of money. And so when people, like I see all the time, people say, oh, follow the money or do these sorts of things. A lot of the people on the environmental side who I think say some of the most absurd things are true believers. It's not because they got paid off. They are absolute true believers in what they're saying. And I think that the emotional benefits of feeling righteous are very powerful. People give up a lot of money to do things that make them feel good about themselves and righteous. And so a lot of the issues that we see are bootleggers and Baptists. I think in the vast majority of cases, journalists are simply true believers. They think that they got into journalism because they wanted to save the world. They wanted to tell the truth and do righteous. And so they do believe that. Now, there is a trend, I will say, that is exacerbating that problem. And what you see are these independent journalism organizations that put people in newspapers. And so there are a number of newspapers that say, if you scroll down to the bottom, this journalist paid for by Journalism for America or something like that. And there's one newspaper in Washington state where they are paid by a environment and climate fund. And at one point they listed all of the donors to the environment and climate fund. And it was all the environmental groups. It was the Sierra Club. It was the Washington Environmental Council. It was all these things. So here is this reporter who's funded overtly by all these environmental groups. Now you tell me, if that reporter wanted to write something that said the Washington Environmental Council is being dishonest or the Sierra Club is being dishonest, could they do that? Probably not. They know who's writing their checks. And so it may not be that they are writing stories that are absurd or just parroting Sierra Club, but I am certain that backing and support prevents them from writing stories that contradict the narrative of those folks. This is not to say that the reporter doesn't believe what they're writing, but it does influence. I am certain it influences how they make decisions.
Okay. Has your guest in his life, irregardless of any affiliations of any side offering a possible solution, encountered a good answer to what is mankind's response to methane clathrate gun issue? I have no idea what that is. What is mankind's response to permafrost thawing out? And let's see, no joke. We could not care less about California's EV push, which we have here in Washington too. Do care about this going off. Nuke seems so impotent compared to this outcome even now. Never mind the oceans going acidic enough not to dilute masses of CO2, incomprehensible to us mortals, and their amounts any longer. Okay. a lot here. Not sure exactly what's going. Tell me, Todd. What do you want? Do you like
So
to
I'll
say?
address two things. One thing
Okay.
about permafrost. So the concern for people who don't know is that as temperatures increase in the Arctic, and what we are seeing is that temperatures are increasing in the Arctic more rapidly than everywhere else, primarily because as ice melts, instead of sun bouncing off of the ice and going back out into space, it hits the dark water. The water absorbs the energy, and so if you look at a map of the globe, you'll see more temperature there. There's permafrost in Alaska, Russia, places like that, that if it gets to a certain temperature, that permafrost will melt, and there's concern that it will release methane, which is a greenhouse gas. And so then you get this rapid increase because it sort of builds upon itself. I don't know the answer to how you stop that methane, how you stop that permafrost. I can tell you that having actually worked on the North Slope, I've been to Barrow, Alaska, which is the northernmost point in Alaska, and I was there in November. Not the greatest time to be there. But they actually build all their houses on stilts because the heat of the houses on the ground melts the permafrost, and then the houses sag. So there are already sort of ways to deal with that. I don't know so much about the methane issue, but other aspects of permafrost melting. With regard to electric vehicles in California, there's an interesting aspect, and this is probably not the question that your commenter is asking about, but I think it is emblematic of the foolish way we do environmental policy. Washington State has a cap on CO2 emissions that says you cannot emit more CO2 than this in Washington State. And of course, that applies to gasoline. Part of a way to reduce CO2 emissions is to switch to electric vehicles. But then we also have this requirement now that by 2035, all new vehicles be electric. So what does that do? It doesn't do anything on top of the cap. The cap is there to ensure that we meet our goals, but says we don't really care how you meet it, just meet the goals. Now, if you mandate electric vehicle purchase on top of that, all you're doing is making that meeting that same goal more difficult without actually adding in any environmental benefit. And what politicians will say to you is, well, we know that we have to do this, right? We're certain that this is what's going to happen. But if you look back at past promises, they never come true. I'm not saying that electric vehicles aren't going to be, a technology of the future. I don't know, but politicians pretend they know. So in Washington State, we were part of a coalition of the West Coast, California, Oregon, Washington, and British Columbia, that was going to create what was called the hydrogen highway, so that every 20 or 30 miles, there was a hydrogen filling station from LA to Vancouver, BC, so that your hydrogen vehicle could fill up. The deadline for that was 2010. Of course, it never existed. It didn't exist. Hydrogen cars still don't exist. They're still a promise. But, back in 2005 or whenever, 2003, whenever they made this promise, they were certain that they knew the future, right? And then Governor Inslee in his book talks about cellulosic ethanol, which is a type of ethanol that is very low carbon intensity and theoretically could be cheaper. And he wrote in his book in 2008 that within a few years, it would be readily available everywhere. Here it is 2023, it is not available. So again and again, politicians say, oh, we know what's going to happen. That's why we're mandating that everybody has to buy an electric vehicle, because it's going to have to happen anyway. If they'd said that about hydrogen vehicles, or if they'd said that about cellulosic ethanol, they would have been wrong. I don't know if they're going to be right this time or not, but putting all your eggs into one basket and acting like you're certain, I just think is foolish.
Okay, I just watched this guy's report on Toyota's take on the push for EVs, and one of Toyota's engineers is saying we could make a bigger impact on climate if we use the finite battery resources in hybrids. So what is Todd's take? Link to the report, which we haven't watched, but
Yeah.
Do you want to skip that one?
No, I think there are trade-offs. People ask me all the time, okay, Todd, what do you think about electric vehicles? Because I see all these stories about the amount of electricity or the amount of energy that it takes to make batteries, and that we mine the minerals from either China, or children are doing things like that. And then, mining, even in the United States, has environmental impacts. And again, these are the trade-offs. The notion that you can just simply say, the science says we must meet 1.5 degrees Celsius or 2 degrees Celsius without considering the trade-offs is not science. It's You're fooling yourself. So if you are concerned about climate change, then those trade-offs might make sense. Yes, I understand that mining is bad. Yes, we need to improve child labor practices, wherever, but climate change is serious enough that we need to do it. Other people may say, look, I'm not worried about climate change. I think we can handle the impacts of it. We can find ways to reduce CO2 emissions in other ways because the costs of electric vehicles and everything else associated with it are too high for me. Those sorts of things. Those trade-offs are personal. Everybody's going to make a different decision. So that's what we need, is a diversity of options. When government comes in and says, here is the path, they preclude other paths that may be more effective, that may have better results, by focusing on what's politically popular rather than what may be best economically or environmentally in the long run. Diversity is the way to do these things. So again, not to plug my book, I will plug my book again, but it's time to think small. But that's what I argue, is lots of small efforts, a diversity of options, so that you're finding the best way to help the environment. And again, the hope for my book is that it can give people who care about the environment but are skeptical of, big government political approaches, better ways to help the environment. And in my experience, they are also more effective.
What about the people who are skeptical of big tech and would be concerned about like data mining and that kind of thing, and using their smartphone, which you say it would help us with the environment, and look at your book and say, Todd just wants more data to go to Google?
So there's a couple of answers to that. One is, I have grown up with technology. I used to be a computer programmer. So, and I am a sort of semi-public person. So I have a much lower sensitivity to protecting my privacy or concern about that than others do. So that's just where I come down. Others are more sensitive. And for you, great. I get it. There are lots of examples of where people will have a smart thermostat like a Nest or an Ecobee, where they sign up for a program that says, okay, if you turn down your thermostat during these hours when there are energy shortages or other things like that, we'll pay you. And some of those actually will turn your thermostat down for you. Now that seems really like creepy to people. And I understand why that seems creepy, right? It seems like they're reaching into your house and controlling that. Now, if you say, all right, I'm willing for them to pay me to do that from time to time. But the other thing I will remind you is that in the case of electricity like that, the government can already do that. They can turn off your power, right? If we just don't have enough power, they turn off your power and it's a blackout. So again, there are trade-offs. I understand that some people are like, well, that's a bridge too far. I don't want to do this. But there are other things that you can do that may be acceptable to you. Again, a diversity of options. No single thing is going to fit everybody. And so rather than saying everybody must have a smart thermostat in their home so that we can control it, I don't agree with that. I would absolutely oppose that. But if you're comfortable with it, great. Go ahead and make the trade-offs for yourself. And if there are other things, if you don't like that and there are other things that you want to do, that's great too.
Did I ever tell you about the woman in Marysville I covered who was like, she's like, I'm zero waste. I recycle or compost everything and I don't need trash anymore. So she canceled her trash. And so she's like, I'm not going to pay for trash pickup. And the city was like, well, you have to have trash pickup to live here. You can't not have trash pickup. And she's like, well, I don't need it. I'm doing exactly what you guys told me to do. I'm recycling everything and composting. I have no waste. And they go, but you have to. So they threatened to shut off her power until she paid her trash bill, which was like at like $13,000. So it was like a ridiculous amount of money. Maybe it was like $1,000, $1,300. But it was just so funny to see, regardless of what you think about recycling, which I think deserves a certain amount of scrutiny as well, that it rarely gets in the news. But yeah, it was just funny that you had this woman who was like doing allegedly what the government said they wanted, that was the solution. And they're like, no, you're doing it too well. So stop, and I believe that we had, isn't there some kind of cap on solar in Washington? Like we can only have so many people. And I know you're a big critic of solar in Washington anyway, but just like say for playing devil's advocate, isn't there some kind of caps where like, yeah, we have this many people can be incentivized, but we can't have people go over this threshold. We have too many people on solar, then it'll cost us too much money. So we do want you to switch to solar, but just not too many, not everyone.
Well, and the funny thing about that is that and they changed the incentives. So Greg Nichols, who was the former mayor of Seattle, who was a big climate activist, had solar panels in Seattle. The National Renewable Energy Laboratory has a map which shows the best and worst places in America to have solar. And outside of Alaska, which is so far north, Western Washington is, I think, the worst place in America, according to them. So here, he's putting solar in a place that is not great. It's getting big subsidies. So then the solar installers said, well, we've already maxed out the subsidies. So the subsidies aren't available to new installations. Can we lower the subsidies and spread the number of people who get it so that we can start installing more solar panels? And so they did that. So that sort of gives you the game that's going on. If you have to pay people to get something, what that shows is that it's not a good use of resources, that you can use your resources more effectively. So that's what happened. That's what happens with solar. And yeah, they have to put a cap on it because it costs so much. If solar was producing more value than it was taking, well, there would be no cap, right? You would want as much of it as possible because it's a net benefit to the economy. But because the only way it works is to subsidize it, you have to put a cap on the subsidy.
Got it. Okay, that makes sense. Okay, back to locals. If it's biochar production a good solution to carbon sequestration? From what I've read, it's the only viable solution. It also improves soil ability to retain water, nutrients, makes an excellent home for beneficial bacteria and mycelium. Even if people don't think carbon in the atmosphere is a problem, it seems like a great idea for cheaper, more bountiful, and healthier farming.
This is biochar, did you say?
Yep. Mm-hmm.
Yeah. So yeah, that's one thing. There's a number of different ways to do soil sequestration, changing how you manage the way you till, the way you leave carbon in the soil. So there's a lot of that, and then it's also good because it improves the richness of the soil. The science sometimes is a little bit difficult on that because it's unclear, but there's those options. But people are working on other things, and I don't have a problem with people working on things that are expensive right now and experimenting. That's a great thing. And one of the things that they do in Iceland is to capture CO2 out of the atmosphere and then store it in the basalt because it attaches to the basalt relatively rapidly and then stays there a very long time. Currently, that's a pretty expensive process, but the prices are coming down. What's interesting about that is that some of the groups that are most opposed to carbon capture and storage, pulling CO2 out of the atmosphere, are environmental groups because they say, well, if we can effectively just pull CO2 out of the atmosphere, then we can keep using fossil fuels. And it's like, okay, I thought you were concerned about the amount of CO2 in the atmosphere. If we can get it to where you want it without having to fundamentally change our society and disrupt everything, isn't that a good thing? And to them, no, that's not a good thing. They want to fundamentally disrupt society. So there are some of those technologies. A lot of them are theoretical. Some of them have higher costs than others, but there's a lot of interesting research going on.
Okay, last couple questions. We don't ban plastic bags. Oh, good. She's doing artwork. Okay. She just wanted everybody to know. Okay. We don't ban plastic bags where I live, nor do we recycle them. Instead, we have a tax per bag used unless you bring your own bag. But this climate thing was big in Davos this year as attendees used private jets to get there. Climate change is being used to divide the ultra rich against everyone else. I don't deny there's a climate change going on. Hell, I've got the entire sci-fi future world built around it. But it's the hows that matter in resolving it, assuming it can be resolved. But starting up an income-based economic war over energy transition isn't the way. Sorry, I can't afford an electric van right now, and I will not get into how that electricity is generated to power it. Thoughts, I guess, then on the sort of socioeconomic parts to this. I think that's kind of where this comment is going, that it seems like it becomes sort of the haves versus the have-nots, or that there's a lot of policy that comes out of. Weren't you the one who used to tell me that electric vehicles are, or what was it that the forced electrical vehicle, or there was something in Washington. There was a policy. I'm sorry, mom brain, but like several years ago, back when I was a journalist and I was interviewing you about the EV incentives in Washington, you were talking about this being kind of like a tax on poor people or something. I remember something like
Yeah.
that.
So what I did is that in Washington State, we didn't charge sales taxes on electric vehicles. And then there are also other subsidies. But I charted, so you can get the data of registered electric vehicles in Washington State and the zip codes they're in. And so I cross-matched the zip codes with IRS tax data to see where the electric vehicles are. And it will not shock you to find that the wealthiest communities have the most electric vehicles and the poorest communities have the least. So you're giving, I mean, there's always this tax breaks for the rich. A sales tax break on electric vehicles was an unbelievable tax break for the rich. The other funny thing about that is that there was a study that came out that said that's okay. Even so, the argument I made was, the other thing is, if you're going to buy a Tesla, if you are wealthy enough to buy a Tesla, the tax break is nice, but it's not the reason you bought the Tesla. It's like, well, I was going to buy a Mercedes S-Class, but now I bought the Tesla because I got a sales tax break. That's not how people think. People were buying Teslas because they were cool luxury cars that they wanted. So what I argued is that the sales tax break wasn't even yielding the policy result what you wanted, which is increasing the number of electric vehicles on the road. And so there was an economic analysis that said, yes, Todd, that could be correct. But when the wealthy save that money, they spend it in other ways that is good for the economy. Now, there is a term for that. It's called trickle-down economics, where you cut taxes on the wealthy and then they spend it to help the economy. And so I pointed out that I was like, the folks on the left who are most in favor of electric vehicle subsidies are also the most critical of tax breaks for the rich that trickle down to help the economy. And yet that was one of the specific arguments that they were making for electric vehicles. So yeah, it's
that's so interesting.
A lot of this stuff is, I mean, the new technology is, you're going to get early adopters. Early adopters are typically the wealthy. I think that that's great because they have the disposable income to try all sorts of new things and see what works and what doesn't, so that then we can piggyback, right? That's how cell phones worked, right? The wealthy had the big brick phones and other things like that eventually came. So now everybody has a cell phone. The same can be true of electric vehicles and other things like that. It's when you inject government money and government says, I'm picking this technology as the best, that you start to get into trouble.
Okay, I got it. With so many environmental conspiracy theories debunked, is this continued push about money and power, well-meaning people having the wool pulled over their eyes? Okay, let me reread that. Is this continued push about money and power, or well-meaning people having the wool pulled over their eyes?
So I think that it is more about people who have disposable income. A lot of the people that you see, I mean, like, so people criticize Bill Gates. Okay, fine. Bill Gates, this is not about money and power for Bill Gates. Right? Bill Gates is spending money to do these sorts of things. He would be better off staying at Microsoft or elsewhere. It is about feeling like he wants to feel like he's helping the planet. He has lots of access to money, lots of access to power. He doesn't need to choose this one. There's people I know who are disagreeing with me right now, but that's my feeling is that Bill Gates doesn't have a shortage of money or power, that he wants to feel like he's helping the environment. And I won't say Bill Gates specifically, but I see a lot of people who are wealthy who are insulated from the costs of their own policy decisions and the policies that they advocate. So if something goes horribly wrong, it doesn't affect their life. They don't get the feedback. Doesn't make their life worse off. And you see a lot of these sort of callous things where the president, when gas prices were very high last summer, he says, well, this is why you should buy an EV. Well, people can't buy an EV. They're very expensive, or even if you could afford one, they may not suit your lifestyle. You need a longer range. You drive longer than that or something like that. So these sort of glib answers of, well, why don't you just do this? That I think people who have disposable income, for whom money is not an object, shows that they are tone deaf. And again, they are trying to make themselves feel good. And since there are no counter incentives in terms of costs or the impacts of their policies that they feel, why not follow those, advocate for those sorts of things?
I totally agree about the money thing. I do, however, think power and public service can go hand in hand. So it doesn't have to be that you're just thinking you're doing something good for the environment and it's not about power. I think social engineering, like saying, I have the secret about how to do this better, can be an ego power thing. I don't know, as a Christian and, someone who's, I got a Master of Divinity degree, which is usually worthless for what I do, except for every once in a while when I get to talk about this stuff, having read, all these philosophers over the centuries talk about this idea, I guess. I think the drive, the God complex drive is very strong in us. That's the way I look at it. And like far greater than the drive for money or the other things that we go after in life would be the idea that once you've attained all these other things, the final thing, like the fall from grace, I guess, this sort of, truest evil is to become God. That's the way I look at it. And I think Jack agrees with me because clearly he's trying to take over the show, or he has another opinion on my show, but I'm going to censor him for now. He's the only one I censor on the show. But that's the way I look at it. I think I think it's almost a metaphysical or existential spiritual drive. And I do think benevolence can be the most evil motivator.
Yeah, as I said before, right? People don't run around protesting about jaywalking. They say, look, I am saving the planet, because that ego thing that you're talking about right there, I think is very powerful to think, look how awesome, look how great I am. So yes, I don't disagree that certainly plays a role in it. I don't think that's the only factor, but I do think it is a factor.
Let me go to two last questions in the live chat on locals. Does Todd have any thoughts on why series hybrid cars haven't gotten more attention to deal with the bridge between technologies and infrastructure?
I think they're not radical enough. I think they're really, it was funny because I met a guy one time who had a Prius C, which is a small hybrid, and a Leaf. And I said, why do you have both cars? And he said, well, because the Leaf is for when I commute and the Prius C is for when I need to drive longer distances. This guy clearly had plenty of money to buy, bespoke cars for whatever he needed. But I think at one point, right, in the 2000s, when electric vehicles were not an option, the hybrids were the cool car. And they were seen as that bridge. Now that electric vehicles exist, they don't send the social signal that people want anymore. In fact, there was a debate, I think in the last mayoral election, where one candidate, I'm probably getting this wrong, it was either that one candidate drove a hybrid and the other candidate drove an electric vehicle, or one candidate drove an electric vehicle and the other candidate biked. And it was like, you're not being environmentally friendly enough, either because they drove the electric vehicle or the hybrid instead of the other. So it's sort of one-upsmanship that hybrids now are just seen as sort of practical and mundane and not really sending a strong environmental signal.
Yeah. You would see us and say, we drive a diesel truck, you must really want to just run the planet into the ground. But if you only considered that versus the fact of like where we live and the treacherous driving conditions and the, stuff we pull behind our truck and where we buy our food and all that other stuff, you don't get the whole picture. So it's just weird anyway to just look at what somebody drives as their determining environmental care or passion. Okay, one last thing. Maybe this was asked previously. Any active approach to military ships and container freighters starting to use something less polluting than bunker fuel? One such ship equals 50,000 cars. Have you heard of anything like that?
Yeah, so there's lots of efforts to offer renewable fuels as an alternative to bunker fuel. Bunker fuel is very polluting. It's funny. There is one statistic that says, one container ship produces more sulfur dioxide than like all the cars or something like that. And when I looked at it, I was like, oh, it is true. But the reason it's true is because our cars and other things don't produce basically any sulfur dioxide anymore because they're so clean. Not that the ships are particularly horrible. It's just that you're comparing it to something that's very clean. But yeah, bunker fuel is relatively dirty. There are alternatives, renewable diesel, things like that, that people are looking at. I don't know all the details of that, but I know that this is an issue, and I know that people are looking at it.
Okay. I think that's all I got, Todd. Any final closing thoughts? We'll just show everybody your book again if they want to go buy it. Time to Think Small, How Nimble Environmental Technologies Can Solve the Planet's Biggest Problems. I know people will ask me, can they buy it somewhere besides Amazon? Because a lot of my audience hates Amazon too. But
You can go directly to my publisher, Charles Bridge, or
okay.
you can go to the Washington Policy Center where I work, and you can find it there. But yeah, it's been nice to chat with you. And what I would tell people is, a lot of the frustration that I hear with journalism, with politics, things like that, is because there is a sense that that the desire to solve a problem is getting mixed up with the desire to impose rules on you. There's an old joke that says, some people on the left don't care what you do as long as it's mandatory. And people get that, right? People react strongly to that, the mandatory element of it. So they say, look, I care about the environment. I care about these other issues. I just want to do it my way, or I don't want it forced on me. I am as big an iconoclast as they come. So I certainly sympathize with that. And what my book and what the work that we do tries to do is to put these issues in context, to say, here's how serious they are. Here's how important they are. They are important. But what are the best ways to do it? And what are the best ways to empower people rather than to impose rules on them? And the good news is there's lots of stuff that we can do that truly helps the environment, that makes a difference, that lives up to our values of wanting to be good stewards without having to require that sort of government imposition of power and costs and things like that. And so that's what my book is about, and that's what our work is about.
Okay. Todd Myers, thank you so much for taking the time. I actually have quite a few people asking lots of questions and lots of discussion around it. I wasn't totally sure if we were just going to put everyone to sleep or if there was going to be interest in it, but I don't know. It's a topic that I think a lot of people are fascinated by, not necessarily for the topic itself, but again, like the dynamics of how the topic is discussed. I think that's like its own level of interest to people. Is like there's like the issue of climate, and then there's the issue of learning about climate or discussing climate, or who's allowed to ask questions. And it does bring up a lot of the interesting dynamics that I've learned I was participating in when I was in the media. And I don't really quite have an answer for all of it yet, other than just to say that, like you were talking about, that I think, unfortunately, it just, whether intentional or unintentional, depending on who the person is that's pushing it, just not the level of skepticism and curiosity in journalism anymore. Like going back to our original article, I mean, when you're basically told that you're a ne'er-do-well if you question this statement, and you're going to have lots of your peers, especially in a place like Seattle. I mean, maybe if you're somewhere else, and that'd be interesting to see how people cover this topic in Alabama, for instance, or Georgia, or somewhere. Is it different? But at least where I was, I just wish there were more, I guess, managers who would be encouraging the kind of just curiosity, not trying to get people to be hook, line, and sinker in the opposite direction at all,
Right.
but to just be more curious to do research and find out if these topics are always presented accurately. And then finally, too, it's just another interesting journey for me has been, and for I think other people that I've come across, is why is climate one of those topics, you know, because I think we could look at it and just like, it just is one of those very divisive topics that we're not allowed to question. But why? Like, why is that? And that's just another, I don't know, hanging Chad question I'll just leave for people. But thanks for doing this, Todd. Thanks for taking the time. And thanks everybody for watching. We will see you next time.